please leave a message. Thank you for calling.
Assalamu alaikum. Yo, bad boy, guess what? I'm stressed. I'm really stressed, man. I just can't take no more. The drugs, the crime, everywhere I look, it's just problems. When will someone stand up and be a hero for the Ummah, man? He's bad. He's brave. He's Hakim. 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 He's bad. He's brave. He's Hakim.
Islamia Media presents A Hero for the Ummah, The Adventures of Hakim. Written and read by Khaleel Muhammad. Adventure 1.3, The Islamic Cadets. Part 1, The Trap.
He's bad. He's brave. He's Hakim. He's bad. He's brave. He's Hakim.
On his way back from the halal butchers, Abdul Hakim Malik Muhammad saw a group of children teasing an old man. They were throwing his cap around and running around him. But as soon as they saw Abdul Hakim approach, they all ran off. The old man stumbled into Hakim and accidentally dropped a bottle he was carrying. It crashed to the floor, spilling drink everywhere. In a half daze, the man looked up. His eyes were glazed over. He could barely stand up straight. He had on worn-out shoes and his hair was long and had patches of mud stuck in it. He smelt awful. He looked down at the smashed bottle at the floor, swaying from side to side. He was drunk.
Are you blind?
He asked Abdul Hakim in a slurred manner. Abdul Hakim looked closely at the man. To his deep shock, Hakim recognized him. It was Rafiq. Hakim was stunned. Rafiq, is that you? Asked Abdul Hakim. Rafiq looked at Hakim as if he was trying to make out his features.
Who are you?
He said as he stumbled forward, about to fall over. Abdul Hakim could smell alcohol on his breath and on his clothes. He grabbed him by the arm to stop him from falling, but it was no use. Rafiq was far too heavy, and he fell headlong on his face. Hakim dropped his bags and rushed to Rafiq, who lay on the floor. He was so drunk that he hardly noticed he'd fallen over, and that his forehead was now bleeding. "Rafiq, are you all right?" said Abdul Hakim, wiping his hair away from his face. He lay Rafiq's head on his lap. Rafiq was a long-time friend of Abdul Hakim's father, Ibrahim. He was the brother that gave him dawah after he was thrown out of the nation. It was Rafiq who introduced him to Hakim's mother, Sumaya. Rafiq was the one closest to Ibrahim and acted as Sumaya's wali at their marriage. He was like an uncle to Abdul Hakim and his brother Ammar. He even suggested the name Abdul Hakim for Ibrahim's firstborn son. But 2 years ago, Rafiq's wife and children died in a car accident, and he blamed himself for what had happened. Since then, no one had seen or heard from him, until now. Rafiq looked up at Abdul Hakim.
Ibrahim? No, you're not Ibrahim. You're his boy, Abdul Hakim.
Hakim forced a smile and said, Yes, it's me, Abdul Hakim. Rafiq, where have you been? What happened to you? We've all missed you. Abdul Hakim could feel tears come into his eyes. Rafiq wiped his mouth and reached into his pocket. He took out another bottle of beer. Hakim's eyes went wide. "Rafiq, no!" Without thinking, Abdul Hakim slapped the bottle on the floor. It didn't smash, but it went rolling into the gutter. Rafiq watched it roll off. "Are you mad? Are you trying to kill yourself?" said Abdul Hakim in desperation. Rafiq looked at him and said, Why else is there to live for? I'm like that bottle. I'm in the gutter too." Hakim was speechless. He didn't know what to say. An ambulance pulled up to the curb. Someone must have called them. 2 of the ambulance crew came out and loaded Rafiq on a stretcher. Abdul Hakim was stunned into silence. He just couldn't believe it. "Rafiq," he whispered, as the ambulance drove off. By the time Abdul Hakim got home, tears were streaming down his cheeks. After he walked into the lounge and told his parents what had happened, Ibrahim immediately grabbed his coat and drove non-stop to the hospital. Rafiq lay on his bed, staring into space. He heard a voice he recognized from what seemed like a long, long time ago. "My brother, why have you stayed away from me so long? Where have you been? Asked Ibrahim, looking down at Rafiq. Rafiq had a bandage wrapped around his head. He turned his face away from Ibrahim. Don't look at me. I'm too ashamed. Because I'm a drunk. And a murderer. He said, shaking. Ibrahim held his hand tightly. No, brother. What happened was an accident. Look at me, brother. Look at me, said Ibrahim in a stern voice. He then recited Surah Al-Fatiha. Rafiq wiped tears falling from his eyes, but he still had his face turned away from Ibrahim. Remember that? That was the first surah you ever taught me, Yaqi. As Allah is my witness, I love you now as I loved you then. Nothing you could do could cause me to be ashamed of you. You showed me the Sirat al-Mustaqim when I was lost, and for that I will always be your brother. Please, look at me. Rafiq slowly forced his head around and faced Ibrahim. They hugged. Imam Hamza Badawi got up from the best position in Salat. There was a calm in his heart that could only come from praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was midday, Saturday, Dhuhr time, and behind him was the Jamaat from the local Ummah. After the Salat, Abdul Hakim came to the Imam. He seemed a little nervous. Assalamu alaikum, said the Imam. The Imam shook his hand and greeted him with a wide smile on his face. He was always glad to see Abdul Hakim, but now he could sense the young brother's unease. Kayfa halik, said the Imam. Alhamdulillah, could I speak to you for a couple of minutes? The Imam nodded. They both sat on the floor as Abdul Hakim reached into his rucksack and pulled out a bundle of papers. Subhanallah, Yakhi, you seem to have a lot of papers there. What are they for? Asked the Imam. On the sheets of paper were roughly scribbled diagrams, notes and papers of some kind. Abdul Hakim looked at the Imam and breathed in deeply. Imam, do you know what some of the brothers and sisters do after school and during their lunch breaks and on the weekends? The Imam shrugged his shoulders and said no. Abdul Hakim looked directly into the Imam's eyes and said, Nothing, brother. Nothing except hang out on street corners, smoking cigarettes and getting into trouble. I had a little trouble with some of them just the other day. They were teasing somebody I used to know. By then a group of brothers in the masjid had gathered around Abdul Hakim and the Imam to listen, including Abdullah, Abdul Hakim's best friend. One of the boys raised his hand and said, It's true, Imam. I see them all the time outside the arcade in the shopping centre. Sometimes they cause a lot of trouble. The Imam looked upset. I'm sad to say that I too have seen them hanging around the city centre, but what can we do? He said as all the brothers began talking at once. Abdul Hakim spoke up. I'm not telling you this to get those brothers into trouble, Imam, but I'm worried that if we don't find something positive to occupy our time with, then sooner or later the shaitan will. I know for a fact that some of the brothers are drinking, and I've recently seen what that leads to. I have an idea that my father has helped me with, which we hope, inshallah, will help us do something about the problem and prevent our brothers and sisters from becoming homeless drunks on the street. The brothers quietened down and began to listen. Hakim placed his hand on the pile of papers on the floor. This is my idea, he said. The Imam gestured for him to continue. I think this masjid should start a club like the Scouts for Muslims, for brothers and sisters. Subhanallah, said Abdullah. That's a great idea. One of the brothers who was now giggling said, Oh, Abdullah, you would say it was a great idea, wouldn't you? Abdul Hakim's your best friend. Before Abdullah could reply, the Imam spoke up. Abdul Hakim, tell us about your ideas, and brothers, please, give him a chance to talk, inshallah. Abdul Hakim went on. Well, you see, the brothers, all of us, need to be more positive and more active in the community. Many of us don't have anything to focus our energies on, and that's why some of us get into trouble. He paused. Go on, Abdul Hakim, urged Abdullah. Hakim looked at the Imam, whose face had gone completely blank. He went on. Abdul Hakim showed them a plan of the Scouts and the different activities they could do. It included outdoor camping, distribution of Qur'ans, Sadaqah distribution, and much, much more. He talked about different branches in different masjids up and down the country, all tied together by the same goals and the love of Allah. By the time Abdul Hakim had finished, everyone was completely silent, even the brothers who were laughing. You could hear a pin drop. Allahu Akbar, said Abdullah, raising his fist into the air. That's a cool idea. Then all the brothers joined in, even those who were been giggling. That was 2 months ago. Since then, letters had gone out to parents who had given permission for 6 brothers to go on their first camping trip, scheduled to last 2 days and a night in the Kent countryside. The brothers, Abdul Hakim, Abdullah, Harun, Naim, Talib and Khalil, gathered together an hour after Fajr outside the local masjid. Abdul Hakim's father, Ibrahim, who had previous camping knowledge, led the brothers, accompanied by brother Jamal, who was Abdullah's older brother. Before they all piled into Jamal's van, they all met a very special person who had come along to see them off. It was Rafiq. He was cleaned up and dressed in the sunnah, but now needed a walking stick to get around. Abdul Hakim hugged him for ages. He looked like the Rafiq he used to know and love all those years ago. May Allah bless you all, brothers, said Rafiq. Suddenly, Abdul Hakim had an idea. He whispered it to his father, Ibrahim. Rafiq, said Ibrahim, the brothers would like you to give them a name, inshallah. For a few moments, Rafiq thought, and then smiled and said, in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, I name you the Islamic Cadets. Blowing her nose, Val flung a log on the fire and stared at her fellow thieves. The only thing that lit their faces was the light from the burning campfire and the full moon in the night sky. There were 6 of them, including Val. Her family gang included Clive and Tony, who sat to her left arguing over who would take first watch that night. There was Mikey, who only came alone because he was bored at home. And of course Paul, who was so thin and tall that he looked as though he was made from matchsticks. He was stuffing his face with a large chocolate bar. The 6th member of the gang, Nev, had just come back from scouting the area. Val and her family gang were in the Kent countryside, breaking into rich estate houses. This was their 3rd night out, and they had camped in an old ruined castle on the top of a hill called St. Brigand's Castle. Well, Nev, anything? Said Val. Nev put down his rucksack and began to warm his hands over the campfire. I counted 13 houses out there. We can go in and take whatever we want. There's not much to stop us, really. 13? That number's bad luck. Did you check them for alarms? Asked Paul, who was stuffing his face with a 3rd chocolate bar. Without looking at him, Nev said to Paul in disgust, Don't talk to me, big boy. I told you to stay at home. That greedy belly of yours is going to get us all into trouble. You watch and see. He threw a stick at Paul that bounced off his bony knee. Rubbing his leg, Paul stood over Nev, who slowly rose to his feet. Val buried her face in her hands. If she wasn't stopping Clive and Tony from fighting, she would be stopping Paul and Nev from fighting. Look, you two. We're here to knock off a few houses, not knock each other's block off, she said. Why did you bring this chocolate baby along, Val? If there's any trouble, he can't make a run for it. Val stood between them and said, Nev, Paul is the best lockpicker and alarm smasher I know. That's why he's here tonight. Unless, of course, you can get us into those houses. Paul grinned at Nev. His teeth was covered with chocolate. He sat down and opened another pack of sweets. Val pulled out the map of the local area and told everyone to gather around. The Islamic Cadets reached the edge of the forest at 1100 hours. After settling down, Ibrahim gathered the brothers into a circle. Brothers, we thank Allah and praise Him over and over again for the blessings He has given us every day of our lives, and we send peace upon the last messenger and prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. From this moment on, I want every one of you to think of yourselves as soldiers striving in the path of Allah. Think deeply about the words of Allah who has said in the Quran, and from among you there must be a group who invite people to all that is good, and enjoin the doing of all that is right, and forbid the doing of all that is wrong. It is they who will attain true success. You and every Muslim, young and old, who can hear my voice, must be that group calling to the good. Each and every one of you must dedicate themselves to Allah and this deen, al-Islam. Do you remember the story of the prophets and his companions who struggled with everything they had in Allah's way? Like them, we must strive fi sabilillah and show the world the Sirat al-Mustaqim. As that group of believers, we must strengthen ourselves to be the example to mankind, at home and at school and even at work. As Muslims, we must be the best in everything we do. At school, work hard for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, attain the highest grades, and show the others how Islam has guided us to the way that is true. Let us turn our backs on the time-wasting activities we see those in school getting involved in. Every brother listened carefully to Ibrahim. They could feel their iman rise with every word he said. After Ibrahim's talk, the cadets made wudu with the water they brought along. Brother Harun made the call to prayer while Ibrahim led the salat right there in the forest. None of the brothers had ever done anything like it before, including Abdul Hakim. For the first time in their young lives, the brothers began to get a good idea of what it must have been like for the Sahabas who journeyed thousands of miles while spreading Islam to the four corners of the world, in beautiful and exotic lands from China to America. After the salat, the cadets spent the rest of the afternoon putting all the tents together and preparing for their first mission. After sundown and joining Maghrib and Isha together, the cadets went out on a 2-mile hike. Navigating their way through the dark forest with maps and the use of their compasses, the cadets soon reached the foot of a large hill where lay the ruins of St. Brigand's castle. "That is our destination, brothers," said Ibrahim, pointing to the top of the hill. "Team 1 will take Route A." The brothers' eyes were wide in amazement, but all of a sudden they could hear a slight rumble in the distance. Something in the darkness became louder and louder. It was the heavy rumble of horses galloping towards them. It was so dark that none of them could see which direction they were coming from. "Cadets, stay calm, all of you!" shouted Jamal, but it was too late. The brothers panicked and all ran off in opposite directions. Abdullah fumbled with his torch as he cried out, "Jamal, do something!" Abdul Hakim dropped his torch as one of the galloping horses brushed against him and pushed him backwards. His legs became tangled in barbed wire as he tumbled head over heels down a long, muddy ditch. He landed flat on his back. Dazed, he tried standing up, but his legs gave away. He stumbled back and fell unconscious. The cold, muddy water seeped into his boots.
The Islamic Cadets, Part 2, captured.
He's bad, he's brave, he's Hakim.
Val jumped up. "Did you hear that?" she said, grabbing her boots. She looked over at Clive, who was meant to be keeping watch, but was fast asleep. "Clive, wake up!" Val shouted as she threw one of her boots at him. The boot struck him in the chest. He woke with a start. What's going on?" he spluttered. "Did you hear that?" "It sounded like shouting," Val said, jumping out of her sleeping bag. Never woke and looked over at Val. Val, what's up?" he said, rubbing his eyes lazily. Val stood up straight, straining her ears. "Shut up, all of you!" She began to listen carefully. "Val, are you feeling all right?" said Clive. Shaking her head, Val said, "I could swear I had some shouting. I'm sure this forest is haunted." "Well, I can't hear anything now." "Well, I can't hear anything. Go back to bed, Val," said Nev. Val folded up her sleeping bag and said, "It's time to get up anyway. Get the others up. We got some planning to do." Jamal and Ibrahim took a head count. There were 5 brothers present. 1 was missing. "Abdul Hakim! Where's Abdul Hakim?" said Abdullah. Waking up, Abdul Hakim began searching his pockets for his torch. Then he remembered. He dropped it just before he fell down the ditch. It took a while for his eyes to get used to the dark, but once they had, he began climbing out of the muddy ditch. Straining his eyes to see at the top of the hill, Abdul Hakim decided to climb to the very top. Insha'Allah, the cadets would all be gathered there waiting for him. It took what felt like 20 minutes to climb to the top. As he did so, he could see and hear people gathered around a campfire among the castle ruins. "Allahu Akbar," he said, happy to see the cadets. He began to run towards the campfire, but as he got closer, he realized that the voices he could hear were not those of the cadets. Abdul Hakim had stumbled across Val and her family gang. By now, all of Val's gang were gathered around the fire and were listening carefully. "Tonight is our last night out, lads. So I want you to take everything and anything that's not bolted down. You understand what I mean?" They all giggled and shook hands. Val paused. At the corner of her eye, she saw Abdul Hakim ducked behind a fallen pillar. She lowered her voice and said, "Listen, there's someone watching us to the right, just behind that pillar. This is what we're gonna do." Abdul Hakim peered at the gang from behind the pillar as the one with the green hat stood up and walked into the forest. Abdul Hakim watched him as he disappeared into the darkness. Watching the others, Hakim could hear everything they were saying. Somehow he had to get word to the police and the Islamic cadets. Just then, Hakim heard footsteps behind him. He whirled to see the man with the green hat lounging at him. Hakim rolled out of the way and began making a run for it, but by then the others had began chasing him. It wasn't long before they all caught up to him. The man with the green hat grabbed him by the scruff of his collar and lifted him into the air. "I got him! I got the little rat!" said Tony. Abdul Hakim was helpless. Back at the campsite, Ibrahim used the radio to call for help. It wasn't long before he was speaking to a gamekeeper, who informed him that help would soon be on the way, but he also said that a dangerous gang was in the area breaking into houses. "Mr. Muhammad, it's very important that you and your boys stay well away from them. They may be armed." Ibrahim's blood ran cold. The gamekeeper continued. "As for your lost cadet, do not try to find him. Wait until the police get there. Do you understand me?" The cadets couldn't believe their ears. "Ibrahim, we can't just leave Abdul Hakim out there. What if that gang gets him?" said Abdullah frantically. All the cadets felt the same way. Not one of them wanted to do nothing while Abdul Hakim was in danger. Ibrahim looked at Jamal, who smiled and nodded at him. "Okay, brothers, okay. With the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's find Abdul Hakim. But we've got to get a few things from the truck first. I think we're gonna need them." They all prepared to leave the camp. Abdul Hakim's hands were tied behind his back. He was sat against a pillar by the campfire. Val and her gang stared at him while they all talked. "What are we gonna do with him, Val?" asked Mikey. "I'm not sure yet. We can't just let him go. We don't know what he overheard us talking about," she said, walking over to him. She knelt down by Abdul Hakim and looked into his eyes. "Hey, punk, aren't you scared? I thought you'd be crying your eyes out by now." Abdul Hakim looked at her and said, "No, what's there to be scared of? All I see is a bunch of crooks stuck in a forest. If I were you, I'd be shaking in my boots. Once my friends find out I'm missing, you'll be crying your eyes out," said Abdul Hakim confidently. "Oh yeah? Who else is out here with you? Your mates?" Abdul Hakim shook his head. "Yeah, a few of us. Enough to get you on a run." "A few of you," said Val. Suddenly there was a hooting sound coming from the bushes. "What was that?" said Mikey. The whole gang jumped to their feet and turned towards the forest. There was another sound, and another sound, coming from different directions. Then another sound, and another. "Hey, Val, what's that? I told you this place is haunted," said Paul, who shoved 10 sweets into his mouth. "Shut up, all of you," she said, trying to hide her fear. She looked at Abdul Hakim. "This is your doing, isn't it?" Abdul Hakim shrugged his shoulders and giggled. Several large balloons filled with water flew out from the forest and struck Mikey and Val in the head, Tony in the back, and the rest on their legs, soaking them to the skin. One landed on the campfire, putting it out. The camp was plunged into total darkness. "Ah! Put the lights out!" screamed Paul. Abdul Hakim could feel a pair of hands untying him. It was Abdullah. "Assalamu alaikum. Ya akhi, what took you so long to get me, you slow coach?" whispered Hakim. "We were a bit peckish, so we decided to stop and get some jalebis first, you know what I mean?" he said, laughing. Val's gang was stumbling around in the darkness, falling over one another. Val tried to open her rucksack and get her torch, but Mikey was hugging her too tightly. Clive and Tony ran into each other and knocked each other out, but Nev and Paul had run off into the forest in blind panic. Val shrugged Mikey off and took her torch out. "Don't come any closer, or I'll hurt your little friend here," she said. She shone the torch at where Abdul Hakim was sitting, but it was gone. There was another sound coming from the forest. Val shone her torch into the bushes. They were shaking. "Mikey!" Mikey was curled up in a ball with his hands over his head, shaking in fear. Val dragged him to his feet and shoved him towards the shaking bush. "Get over there and see what's shaking that bush. Go on!" Trembling like a leaf in the wind, Mikey carefully walked over to the bush while Val shone her torch at it. As he got closer, 2 of the Islamic cadets, Naim and Talib, pounced out and flung a huge bag over his head. "Oh, Val, help! Help!" screamed Mikey. Val began to back off. Naim and Talib used a piece of rope to tie Mikey up while he had his head still stuck in the bag. As he fell over, the 2 boys high-fived each other. Val dropped her torch and put her hands in the air. Okay, you got me. Whoever you are, I'll come quietly," she said, shaking, half petrified. Ibrahim, Khaleel and Haroom came out of the bushes and tied Val's hands behind her back. Just then, several officers and the game warden turned up.
Well done, sir. You've caught those housebreakers, I see. Very impressive.
Ibrahim looked up and said, "Not all, there are still 2 more, but I think they're in for a nasty surprise," he said, winking. Trying to make a break for it, Nev and Paul ducked into a hollow log.
Good. They'll never find us in here,
said Nev, still panicking.
"We'll stay here till daybreak, until we can make our way out,"
he continued. Paul was nervously chomping a chocolate bar while looking into the forest.
"Yeah, we'll get out pretty soon. They'll never get us."
He threw the wrapper on the floor. Just then, something bit Nev's leg.
Ow! Paul, stop pinching me or I'll wallop you!
Paul looked surprisingly.
I didn't pinch you. Why would I? Ow! You stop pinching me,
he said in pain. They both heard a squeak by their feet. They looked down slowly and shone their torch into the log. There were 3 huge, massive rats.
Ow!
Yelled Paul as they both jumped out of the hollow log. As they ran into the forest, there was a whooshing sound as a rope trap sprung around their legs, lifting them high into the air. Abdul Hakim, Abdullah and Jamal came out from behind the log Nev and Paul were hiding in. They were laughing themselves to tears. The rest of the Islamic cadets and the police came rushing over to the boys.
"My word, lads, how did you know they were hiding in that log?"
asked the game warden.
"Oh, it was easy. We just followed the trail of the sweet wrappers that skinny one left behind."
The Islamic cadets got back to the masjid later that morning. Outside the gates were their parents and a crowd of people waiting to greet the brothers. They were cheering, clapping and shouting. The parents of the cadets took them into the hall next door to the masjid and showed them their new uniforms. After the excitement had died down, Abdul Hakim took a few moments to talk to his uncle Rafiq. "Brother Abdul Hakim, I'm so glad that Allah has raised you into the Muslim that you are today. The Islamic cadets have given the Ummah hope for the future, and you've all showed me that we must hold on tightly to the rope of Allah and never let go. Keep on striving, brother. Allah loves those who strive in His way. For their reward are gardens beneath which rivers flow, and that is a fitting reward indeed for those that are righteous." I've only got one thing to say to that, Uncle Rafiq. Alhamdulillah. Abdul Hakim hugged his uncle as tears came to his eyes.
The Adventures of Hakim is released by Islamia Media. Written and read by Khaleel Muhammad. Sound engineer is Najib Bateman. Project manager Tayyib Shah. Incidental music Abdul Latif Whiteman. To order further copies of this tape or for more information, please call 0171 700 7586. The Adventures of Hakim. A hero for the Ummah. Welcome to the front line.